Well, nice to see everyone coming into the webinar, and welcome to CGHE seminar webinar number 339. And we've got Søren Bengtsen and Lynn McAlpine with us today to talk about transitions in the humanities doctorate, a case study from Denmark. At this point, I'd like to introduce our presenters. Søren Bengtsen, Associate Professor at the Department of Educational Philosophy and General Education at the Danish School of Education at Aarhus University. Very active and important leader in our field. And Aarhus is doing a lot of things in relation to global and European discussion of higher education and related matters. So it's really exciting to have Søren on our webinar today. And with him, we have also Lynn McAlpine. Lynn is a colleague of mine, is a Professor Emerita of Higher Education Development at the University of Oxford. She's a well-known international researcher. She's been pretty active really across large parts of the world, but she particularly has focused on doctoral and postdoctoral trajectories within and beyond the academy. So we look forward to the contributions that Søren and Lynn will now make. And at this point, I think I hand the screen to you, Søren.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Simon, for this kind introduction. And we're very happy to be here and look very much forward to discuss with everyone. So I'll start out and then Lynn will take over afterwards. I hope you can see my slides.
Yes, we can.
All right. Yes, so this project, we call it Transitions in the Humanities PhD. A case study from Denmark, and it sort of springs from an ongoing research project called Research for Impact, integrating societal impact and research in the humanities PhD. So it focuses on Denmark and the humanities PhD. And what we hoped for you to reflect on is maybe how your country context and international contexts may influence on this whole discussion around societal value or societal impact of the PhD. It's a 4-year project, so we are 2 years in, so halfway. So we have something to share, but it's still an ongoing project, of course. We are 9 researchers in the project, so 5 from the Danish School of Education based there, and 4 in an international team of co-investigators where Lynn is one of them. I have a slide with all the names of the people that I can show later. Yes, so why Denmark as a context? Well, many of the global drivers we also see enacted in Denmark, but in a particular way perhaps. And some of them are quite significant, maybe to a special Danish context. In relation to PhD education, universities in Denmark have been increasingly centralized with top-down management, which has probably happened in many universities. And also the PhD schools have been centralized to a large degree. And since 2007, it was mandatory to have a PhD school in a university. So all students will be enrolled in a PhD school. PhD schools are not quite the same as graduate schools. They only focus on the PhD level. So it's not the MA programs, for example. And they're quite central and quite large entities. So they're on the faculty level, which is the highest level, just before the leadership of the university. So in Aarhus, for example, there are over 250 PhD students in the humanities PhD school, making it the largest in Northern Europe. And the PhD schools have increasingly formalized PhD education and focused also on more generic courses, transferrable skills, identification, and sort of that whole professional orientation. Also, since the famous 2003 university reform in Denmark, or infamous, there's been increased focus on accountability, how to identify societal impact of research, how to inscribe that notion when you apply before you even start the research. And also the funding schemes focus more on local partners and external partnerships in the humanities. So that makes it more often also more mission driven and sort of problem solving or problem oriented, which is still a little unsettling for researchers in the humanities, I think. Yes, the humanities, well, in Denmark, they comprise what you would expect, philosophy, religious studies, art, literature, music, media studies, information studies, and so on, archaeology, history. But they also include education or pedagogy, which is probably part of the sort of Northern European Germanic tradition. And sometimes they include psychology and anthropology too, and sometimes they don't. It depends a little bit on each university. But they are quite different from the social sciences, so they're separate from the social sciences. But the humanities research has slided towards the social sciences. It has become more empirically oriented, with empirical components, more interdisciplinary. There's an increase in the number of paper-based PhD dissertations, which is also a carryover from a different field or different research tradition. And the focus on the project team and the co-supervision is also a carryover from other research traditions, perhaps mainly in the sciences and in health. So we have this sort of slide or this move in the humanities towards traditions that come from elsewhere, which creates a lot of tensions in how researchers understand their own mandate to decide what research means and how it's also how they supervise the research, the PhD projects. Yes. So these changes in the PhD education, in societal expectations of societal impact and value generation and humanities, sort of crystallize into different purposes in the PhD, at least 3 really significantly different purposes of the PhD. I have 4 here, but maybe I think it's only 3. The first one is discipline or the specialized knowledge purpose or focus, which is sort of what we know, focusing on the international research environments, creating original creative research within a certain field or certain subfield or clustered fields, and focused around the PhD dissertation. And the leaders here are the supervisors and the PhD students themselves. So the leadership, the ownership, and the agency lies very much with the researchers. And we could maybe call this an epistemic imperative in the PhD. Then we also have this financial or economic imperative, which you probably know as well in your country context too, which focuses not internationally but on the national labor market or job market, the labor market context, because PhD holders move increasingly beyond the academy into professional careers after. And this focus on economic growth and labor market contribution and the knowledge economy and the certain skills that are relevant and important in a national perspective is different from the other purpose. So here we see these more generic courses focusing on communication, innovation, entrepreneurship. And students also met with this career focus very early on in their PhD learning journey and these considerations about where they're going and which conflicts with maybe their passion and their interest from the discipline. It doesn't have to conflict, but it is different rationales intersecting. And then I have these 2 other, maybe I'll just bring them together here, which could be called a societal expectation, societal also demands. I've called them here, you can see, moral imperative and a political imperative inscribed into the PhD. And this comes in often with the local partnerships because it is in Denmark, and there's quite a lot of PhD scholarship funded by local stakeholders too, not only on the national level or international funding, but also the local or regional funding, which could be collaborations with museums, art museums, history, archaeology, teacher training colleges, small businesses, large businesses, even Danish police, the Danish defense, public libraries, research libraries, sometimes unions even become part of these constellations, municipalities. So we have a lot of various forms of different stakeholders that want often a problem to be solved or very particular mission to be focused on. Also, sometimes it could relate to citizenship, to solving sustainability issues, or to social justice, for example, trying to collaborate and bring together in the research project so-called societally marginalized or groups in the societal peripheries as part of the research team, not just as a dissemination where you tell about social marginalized groups, but actually bring them together into the project, which is also tangential to notions of academic activism. And these different purposes, they really pull in different directions, and PhD supervisors and students are, and even PhD leaders are also sometimes quite uncertain of how to navigate. Now, I just have one more slide before I hand it over to Lynn. Because in the project, we try to focus on this sort of across or nested perspective, which is a sort of a Lynnish or McAlpine-ish way of terminology, the nested context or the nested understandings of the societal impact and value. We could also call it ecological, inspired from Ronald Barnett's work, the ecological university or ecological agency or ecological different forms of entanglement in relation to societal interconnectedness. And we have three research foci or project foci, or here I call them work packages, and they're being led by different members of our research team. The first one is led by Andrew Gibson, who's at Aarhus part-time and also Trinity College in Dublin, focusing on, this is what Lynn will speak to because he's also involved in that work package, focuses on the macro, meso levels of national policy and institutional strategizing around the PhD, and also PhD school leadership. So interviews with PhD school leaders from the 5 largest humanities PhD schools in Denmark, and how they need to implement policy, need to strategize and document various forms of outcome and impact, but also want to sustain and develop the researcher communities. And actually, many of them also want to have closer contact to supervisors and students who are part of these PhD schools. But Lynn will say more about that. Then we have another work package led by Signe Skov in the project, focusing on the meso and macro layers or dimensions in this sort of academic stakeholder perspective. Interviews with the research leaders, PhD supervisors, some of them who are leaders of research programs at the universities, and that sort of in-betweenness of partly complying with the policy that PhD schools strategize around as a compliance to national policy, but also showing different forms of resistance on a local level in the way that they articulate their role as supervisors. And the last work package led by Hatice Nurila. 2 first ones are postdocs leading, and we have a PhD student project here as the 3rd work package, focused on the micro meso levels of PhD researchers themselves or PhD students, and how they experience meeting the bureaucracy or the PhD schools and the various expectations that come from the discourses in the institution, from their supervisors, from media, from friends and family, and so on, depending also on if they're international students. So across different layers, but with the same focus on how the PhD and the humanities and societal impact sort of evolve around each other and intersect. Yes, I think probably that my time is up now, so I will unshare and hand it over to Lynn. There you go, Lynn. If you're there. Can't hear you, Lynn.
Hello, Lynn. Have we lost you? There she is.
Can you can see me now, right?
We can see you.
And hear me. Okay. Sorry. What I want to do is build on what Søren has said. And you've seen this slide, and I'm going to, as he said, focus now on that WP1 and tell you a little bit about what we're beginning to find out in relation to this. And so one of the really interesting things for us is that in doing this research, we were very struck by the notion that we could find research on research leadership or academic leadership, but we haven't found much in the way of research education leadership. Like, how do leaders carry out that function, the dual function of pedagogy and research? So that's part of what I'm going to talk about now, is what we found from this pilot. And as Søren said, it's in the Danish context. And so we have 5 institutional cases. And what we did was we interviewed these people who are responsible for the Humanities PhD schools. We also did a policy analysis, both at the national level and at the institutional level. And what we were wanting to try to understand was, how do these people position themselves? How do they perceive their notions of leadership? How do they think of themselves in relation to the other actors? And so what I want to do is lead you through the kinds of things we found about them as people, then the variation in the structures that we found in looking across the 5 cases, and then what we're seeing about areas to explore in more detail. So what was very interesting to us was, although they had quite distinct journeys, they shared similar views about certain things. So if they assess their own past experience of the PhD and the present PhD, they would often compare and contrast. So if they really enjoyed the independence in their PhD, they might say, oh, these days students don't seem to have so much independence. But if they'd had really a rough journey in their own experience of the PhD, they said things like, well, today people have much more support than they did when I was doing it. The second thing is, they all shared some past leadership experience. They had been leaders of different kinds in their institutions and had been there for some time, although they hadn't all been in this present role for long periods of time. But clearly, they already had an interest, a commitment in supporting the institution and helping it achieve at least some of its missions. And the third thing that they all shared was a deep investment in students. And this became a motivation for their efforts as research education leaders. But as I said, there was variation in the different institutional contexts. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. So again, we have these 5 people, and they're in very different kinds of institutional environments. So the one thing they had in common was that they had all in some way implemented these national policy regulations. So they'd created policies they felt reflected that. And so they were consistent in that regard, but how that got enacted varied because of a range of things. So one was their location. Some were rural and some were urban. The rural ones tended to attract local students. The urban ones were more internationalized and drew in people from the rest of Denmark. And in some sense, the rural universities sometimes felt that they were losing students to the urban settings. Their histories were different, and that became important in how they situated and moved themselves forward. So their histories, just like their biographies, shared similarities but also differed. And for instance, one of the schools combined social sciences and humanities in a PhD school. The scale was quite amazingly different. So we had from 34 students in one, which would be like a department, to 268. Programs that covered from 6 fields to 16 fields. And there was, because of this difference in scale, there were fewer and more layers, so more hierarchical structures, and fewer and more resources in the larger as opposed to the smaller institutions. Again, the access to students varied. If there's 34 students, you can know them all intimately. When there's 268 and you're committed to students, then it's how do you engage with them or understand their experiences. The larger ones had more external links, and the more that there were layers, there were more challenges to the coherence in the ways in which the policies were enacted. So that gives you kind of a rough view of what we've been finding. And now I want to go on to the kinds of things that we're seeing emerge and that we want to, oh, I forgot this was important. 3 of them were directors of humanities PhD schools only. 2 of them were also vice dean of research. So they're combining research leadership with research education leadership. So this is an interesting phenomenon that I'll reflect on shortly. So the takeaways, again, remember it's a national case study with 4 institutions nested within it. So first of all, we could see quite clearly there is interaction between the individual actors and their biographies and the historical and structural factors, leading to some variation across the 5 institutions. We also saw degrees of university collaboration and competition, and are interested in exploring more about how does that get worked out. Collaborating could be positive, but also competing for students or funding or whatever. Søren mentioned these community partnerships, that there's also the issue of societal engagement. To what extent does the humanities PhD school, do the students and do their supervisors engage with society? But that runs against the idea of to what extent does society support humanities and humanities PhD? And there's quite a lively debate, some of it quite public, going on in Denmark about societal support around this issue. Another is we want to understand more about the institutional decision-making processes when the issues of scale are quite small as opposed to when they're quite large and there's more and more hierarchical structures. And we're also interested in the value of those 2 roles when they're able to combine research education and research leadership. Does that provide more degrees of freedom, more potential to see synergies? And that leads to this question of policy and enactment. So these leaders are given the task of creating policies, but also of seeing them enacted. And so one of the questions we have is how, or do they understand and use what influence they have, and where do they use it? So overall, we'd say we can see value in this kind of national case study approach, and we want to explore it more. And in ending, Søren, is there anything you'd like to add to this kind of summary of where we've got to?
Maybe only to say that it's very interesting to follow the development of the PhD schools, how they move between the different layers in the universities, from departments to a cluster of departments to become more and more centralized, and also between disciplines. So the PhD school as a plastic unity or plastic organization within the organization is just something I think is also visible to see from what you have described, Lynn. The PhD school as an amorphous sort of entity. Yeah, but no, thank you.
Okay, and I'll now put on the slide that Søren promised. And I think this is the end, Simon, so we're ready for discussion.
Well, thank you both. Very interesting. I've got a couple of questions, and we've also got an interesting one from Fernando Herrero, who's just written to me to say he's having lunch, and we could probably address his question without him actually coming onto camera and sharing his meal with us. But let me ask a couple of questions first. Søren, how do policymakers in Denmark see the role of the PhD? I mean, what's its mission? Is it primarily or only for academic development, for the preparation of people for academic posts? Is it also for taking a knowledge leadership role in the economy and the society? Is there a notion that the doctorate will be preparing people for work outside university sector as well as inside it? And what implications does that has for the development of the policies which you described to us?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I'm happy to see that Andrew Gibson is here. Maybe he can also supplement, because he knows more about this than I do. But from my understanding is that the national policy is quite thin, or what there is available on the national level. It sort of blows a little in the wind, both the meaning of what value is from a PhD holder, or how the PhD holder, as you described, Simon, can interact with society, but also what the meaning of society means, which is something that Andrew and I are looking into at the moment. That these two, both the notion of value and the notion of society, are quite empty, and needs to be filled out by someone else, possibly the institutions, but their strategizing is not really so much about types of careers as you described. In Aarhus, it has been more about the innovation, the economic agenda. What you describe, new forms of knowledge work or stewards of knowledge into society, I haven't seen it in the material. I don't know, Andrew, if you have some things to add here.
Yeah, thanks, Søren. I would just say briefly, yeah, how society is framed in the Danish policy, and Sue Wright's work here is very relevant. Society is understood quite narrowly, and it's explicitly set out in the Universities Act that society basically means government, it means local government, it means large business, so not even including small business here, and community schools. That's basically how society is framed. There's no mention explicitly in terms of the media. There's no discussion of civil society. So it's quite unusual, Denmark, for someone coming from an Irish perspective, to see quite an explicit formulation of what society is in policy.
What about the question of the humanities as culture, as human cultural forms and people's sensibilities and participation in culture? I mean, is that seen as in a significant role?
Some of the supervisors, that would be maybe the traditional reply, that they would say formidling or dissemination, that you present your work to the wider public through different talks or maybe courses for people who want to continue their lifelong learning. But that's sort of the traditional way of describing it. It doesn't really, it's not enough, because the funding doesn't really allow that to happen, because the partnerships are more about actual collaboration than just disseminating your research to the always patient and interested public after your research has been completed. So that is definitely changing. Also in the media, there's been a lot of humanities bashing, as we call it. Maybe you have had that too in the UK, where this culture dimension, or the maybe original, maybe a big conservative understanding of Bildung has been attacked.
Yeah, I was
Sorry.
go on.
Well, I was going to mention in relation to the research education leaders, when they were talking about humanities, it was very much about it being embedded culturally and societally. That's what they do, is look at culture, look at society. But only one of them actually highlighted the fact that part of the role of humanities is to preserve heritage. That it's not just about the present and examining what's going on, but it's also about not losing the past. And I think that's quite a compelling argument, but it's not one that one often hears articulated. The other thing is, Søren, you might explain at this point this question from Fernando about what the humanities consist of. Like, it's quite different from the UK, for instance.
Right. I was going to ask some more questions before we brought in Fernando, but let's do that. I mean, I think now Lynn's opened it up. And Fernando's sort of saying to us, okay, tell us about the humanities in Denmark. What are the stronger fields and subjects? What are the marginal fields? What are the standard connections? I mean, I think he's asking you to flesh out a bit further the picture you've already started to create.
Yes, and of course, depending on what strong and weak means here. But if you talk about being funded, I think her teacher in her project, she calls them the classical and the new or the modern humanities, and distinguishes, for example, media studies, information studies, global studies, aesthetic and culture, and these newer fields of research and these newer disciplines, if you can call them that, actually interdisciplines that have turned into kinds of disciplinary cultures in their own right over time. They receive a lot of the funding, so the classical humanities are struggling more if we talk about the classical languages and the smaller languages and philosophy, philology, and so on. If that means weak funding-wise, but these disciplines are still very important for the others because they, of course, draw on them in order to develop their own disciplines. So there is this, yes, they're weak in relation to surviving in the funding game, but they still have a lot of disciplinary credibility, if that's a reply.
I was at a meeting with Susan Wright from Aarhus couple of weeks ago in Finland, and I was really struck by how instrumental and also how rather centralized the Danish approach has become. And there are lots of resemblances with UK, and that was what immediately jumped out. And this hard-nosed instrumental approach to the humanities is it's going to be out of synchrony, isn't it, with what many humanists feel, many of the practitioners feel. So what happens then? I mean, how do research leaders manage that tension between the way the humanities are being positioned and funded and the way in which they're understood and practiced, the sensibilities of them?
It's a good question, and that's exactly also one of the drivers of the project, because Denmark is sort of between cultures or between traditions, between belonging to a Germanic culture, or Northern European, mainly probably Germanic, Scandinavian universities, and perhaps looking towards the UK and the US and implementing a different form of management, at least what has been happening, I think, in the UK. So there's a lot of tension, and and that's also why we look at it across the different levels and include the leadership level too, instead of just seeing that as managers or implementing policy, but trying to get at those tensions that you mentioned, Simon. That's really the interesting things in the project at the moment, which we are doing now.
It's not just what we think about as academic faculty, isn't it? It's also what students want too. And I've interviewed a bit with students in the humanities, and one of the things that comes through is that people are quite they push back against the anti-humanities talk. They identify with what they're doing. They're doing it because they choose it and like it and are good at it. They like working in history or literature or philosophy, and they see it as enlarging of them in the Bildung sense, of formative and growing for them. and they see themselves as becoming more capable as people through that, which always to me resonates strongly with the the Central West European tradition in Bildungen, of the notion of higher education as a broad-based personal formation in the intellectual sense, positioning the graduate in the society as a contributor to the public good, and cultural maintenance and transformation. And I think that's still quite convincing for a lot of people. And yet it seems to be radically out of synchrony with how regulation and policy and funding understand the humanities, and in the social sciences too. And yet people still want to study these disciplines, not in terms of their usefulness to the economy, but in terms of their enlarging intellectual and cultural and personal forms.
It's you can also say something, Linda. I have a comment.
What was you recall I mentioned about their commitment to students. And one of the things that comes through in their talk about that is they see students as kind of the cutting edge of the future of humanities.
Yes.
Like, what are they interested in? Where are they going? And that was quite an enlightening thought, to see these PhD researchers in the forefront. Of course, that means they're dealing with some of the tensions that more senior humanities people haven't had to deal with so early on. But I thought that was quite striking, and it relates then to their support for these students in handling the kinds of tensions that can emerge, both in engagement in society, but also in framing and moving forward their research project.
Definitely. Can I just add to that, if that's okay? Because the notion of the humanities, it doesn't really make a lot of sense it makes sense to the PhD school leaders, because they need to group different disciplines into a larger term or umbrella term, and then they use the humanities because they are leading PhD schools and need to make a case. They can make a case for each specific discipline. They need to make a case probably for the entire humanities. But on the level of students and supervisors, that term doesn't really make any sense, because they would immediately go back to their, to some other language, probably in history, or maybe in English, or in philosophy and literature, or even speak about certain events historically that were interesting, or certain works of art. They would go into specificities or very specific understandings of the world, and what matters and what's important. So the whole idea of the humanities, I think we're also seeing the sort of the underbelly of that construct, how it's not really well anchored within the institutions, I think.
What's the pattern of student demand? I mean, are students still applying for humanities programs as they in the same numbers? What about PhDs?
I think it's quite steady at the moment, but some years ago there was a push for increased enrollment in PhD schools, but I think it's sort of quite stable at the moment. But that, you also mentioned that, Lynn, it's very different from university to university how much they prioritize the humanities, for example. Where in Aarhus, they're really building up a large and very strong humanities PhD school, and I think they're also trying to do that at Aalborg. But they're doing that by merging it with the social sciences PhD school. So the different institutions have different strategies for promoting the humanities.
We're open to questions, folks, those who are participating in this webinar.
Questions and also comments, maybe, because
yes, please. Yes,
it would be nice to hear from other country context or institutional context.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know if these kinds of developments are occurring across Northern Europe too, especially, I think. And we've got another comment from Fernando. Tension between the Germanic Northern European culture of Denmark and the Anglo. Yeah, what are the differences as well? So I'll talk about the similarities. Tell us the differences between the Denmark and the Northern European, if that's a doable equation, and the Anglo.
I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that. Really, what the whole how the changes have been through the last maybe 20-25 years. As I said, I think Denmark and more also Sweden and Norway, probably also Finland, are feeling some of are considering moving in the same direction as Denmark has done, which is not necessarily a smart direction, but the close ties to the state, for example, that then results in different forms of governance and move towards an increased form of centralization and managerialism. But Denmark has been sort of maybe the first mover, which I'm not exact. I don't know why. I think maybe Sue could answer that question. Maybe you know, Simon. I don't know.
I mean, the pattern that we're seeing in the UK is that the traditional elite university humanities schools quite strong. You know, the Oxford, Cambridge humanists are flourishing. Everything's fine. They've got terrific students coming in, and they can get research grants from charities and foundations and so on. British Academy. So although, you know, there's always that cloud over the humanities in the modern university, I think that, you know, the kind of instrumentalism and economism work against them. But they're pretty strong in the strong universities, and also at the UCLs and King's colleges, and you know the Edinburgh and you know the others in the Russell group towards the top. It's in the middle level and beyond and lower tiers that we're in this highly hierarchical UK system that, you know, the humanities obviously face more, you know, existential crisis, if you like, longer term. But there is that, I suppose, that, you know, the old elite base is reproductive and sustains the disciplines and sustains the sort of what you might call the positive freedom of it, you know, the positive culture. And maybe that's, so I suppose the equivalent in Denmark would be Copenhagen, wouldn't it? Is Copenhagen sustaining the humanities in a different way to the other institutions, or is it in a less hierarchical system, everyone is being flattened into the economist straitjacket, so to speak?
Yeah, probably so. But again, there are differences, and Aarhus chose to move into this big merger in 2010, where the School of Education, well, actually the Faculty of Education and the Faculty of Humanities and the Theological Faculty were merged into one sort of super faculty of the Faculty of Arts, it's called. And Copenhagen has traveled at a different route and not done that. So it's quite different. But I also want to say that reply depends on where you look, I think, Simon, or who you ask, because if we talk about PhD students and supervisors, we have a dean in an interview saying that there's no problem, as you were maybe indicating, there's no problem in the humanities. They are as popular as they maybe have ever been, and they're also a big support in society for humanities and the understanding and importance of culture and so on, and heritage. But it's not what the PhD researchers and supervisors are necessarily feeling, because they need to navigate on the inside of the bureaucracies with different conflicting demands to what they should, how they should supervise and what for, and what they should plan to do with their PhD. So maybe I think, yeah, I'd also encourage to focus more on how the policy is being maybe indirectly experienced by PhD researchers and supervisors.
Right.
I think Jan has a very interesting question.
Right. Well, let's bring her onto camera. Jan, are you there, please?
Hello. Yes, I'm here. Hello, everyone from Scotland. So my question's about sort of, I suppose, the terrain on which we debate the humanities. And so somebody said to me the other day that we spend too much time trying to defend them, and that we're always put in this defensive position. So I'm just really wondering your thoughts on that. And also, but what would the alternative look like? Because, you know, sort of what they were saying to us is, even when we promote the humanities, we seem to always do it from this defensive position. So I'd just welcome any thoughts on that, please.
Could I say something first, Lynn, and then you could, or Simon, if you have comments? I think that's really true, Jen, and that's also what we see. I think we see in the interviews with the supervisors, they're searching also for another language, because it's so easy to fall into a defensive language and forms of resistance that towards the system, or the call for quantifiable measures, or we should identify with methods or forms of audit that humanities do not themselves believe in, and so on and so forth. But they're also aware of that they need to find a language where they can speak beyond the defensiveness, or a non-defensive language. What that looks like, I don't know, but I think that's sort of what we're interested in trying to unpack from some of the interviews with them, what it is that they're searching for. Maybe they don't know it themselves, but there's a lot of things going on in their reflections about this, which is not only a one-sided critique or resistance. But I would love to hear an alternative language or approach. Yeah.
So what's your suggestion, Jan?
I don't know, because I think we're up against a lot of difficulty, because I have a sort of a second point, is that even where the powers that be do support the humanities, it's often in this rarefied and stereotypical way. So I had a teacher from a disadvantaged school in England say today that Ofsted, the school regulator, requires them to ensure that students have cultural capital. What they mean by that is that they sort of have to be able to quote Latin in a tricky situation like Boris Johnson does. And we were talking about, instead the humanities is about a doorway into understanding your shared culture and past culture, and sort of some of what binds a society together. And I suppose it's invisible in a way, isn't it? And that's where its strength comes, but that's where its weakness is in this very instrumental world.
Yeah,
I think it may be societally invisible. I don't think it's invisible to them. They can see it. They know about it. They understand what that means. But it's maybe societally invisible in a way. So someone to take leadership on that new language or terminology, vocabulary development is also needed. Where should it come from? The individual supervisor, or I don't know, the dean, the PhD school? Where should that come from?
I think it's a really interesting question, and we could probably spend a lot of time discussing it, because as a social scientist, I also feel that sometimes that we're defending our own fields of knowledge in relation to STEM fields, for instance. And, one of the things that struck me is, to what extent are we allies? Could we be allies? And how do we collectively start creating a discourse that shows what's valuable, what we're contributing? And I guess I also wonder, to what extent can we look to STEM fields to see how do they articulate what they do in ways that are seen as being powerful? That doesn't mean we'd use the same discourse, but like, what is it that they're so persuasive about that we haven't yet managed? So we move from a position of feeling relatively weak to one where we feel positive about the things that we're doing.
I think the advantage that mathematics and the natural sciences have as disciplines is that their role is foundational in the applied science fields, and that's that whole gamut of things from engineering to computing to medicine and paramedicine and so on. Their role in relation to those fields is unequivocally accepted. And you can't do without mathematics. More mathematics generally means better in terms of all of those other fields as well. And it's the same with biological knowledge and so on. So that's obviously foundational to medicine and related fields. So that connection is accepted. But the same argument that's often applied to the humanities is, outside the value for money, the economy, somehow unconnected to it, could be made against the core sciences as well. But the difference seems to be that the society encourages humanities up to the end of school as a normal field of study for at least half the student population. And then after that, no longer, and pushes them into business studies or applied social sciences rather than continuing in the humanities. Whereas in the natural sciences, the notion of doing it at first degree level as a foundation for something else perhaps is more accepted. It seems quite just a matter of custom and practice more than anything else, because clearly the humanities are foundational to an enormous range of disciplines that are pursued at tertiary stage, but they're not accepted any longer in the same way themselves at tertiary stage. I mean, but it's no coincidence that a large number of social leaders have been educated in history and philosophy and literature and so on, you know, that it creates sensibilities and formative behaviors which are really useful in a whole range of ways in exercising a social role. The capacity to communicate in depth is only one of those. To use words well, you know, that, but I mean, it's hard to imagine life without history and philosophy, isn't it? And yet somehow those disciplines at tertiary level are being pushed to the margin almost, and philosophy is almost falling off the cliff. And there's nothing more important than philosophy, really, intellectually. So it is very odd. And I mean, higher education is a strange beast and hard to explain sometimes.
It's these narratives that we also construct as Rachel and Wellman's book, Permanent Crisis, which also explores the notion of crisis in the humanities, which would be an argument for maybe exactly that understanding of crisis is defining. Maybe that is sort of part of what you're saying, Simon, that that's the premise, that's the foundation for something happening within what we call the humanities. Exactly that, that it comes over as defensiveness is perhaps unlucky, but maybe there is a form of identity formation going on exactly in that crisis. Maybe we don't want it to go away. Now we're speculating, right? But the element of crisis is certainly important, I think.
Well, I think also there's more cynically, there's a kind of cultural capital factor as well. You know, the notion that cultural capital is somehow something that's special and selective, and the notion of an embattled cultural community is actually feeds into that selectiveness and exclusiveness too as well. You know, yes, no one understands us, no one respects us, but we're really special. And of course, that rather goes against the grain of the sort of democratic movement in the humanities and social sciences of the last 50 years, you know, which tried to open them up for everyone and still does, I think. But you know, it's never quite over, is it? I mean, as you say, the crisis is endemic and perhaps part of the identity. I remember the J.H. Plum book from the 1960s when I first came into higher education in the 70s. You know, that the crisis in the humanities was one of the books that everyone was reading in the humanities departments. But you know, it never quite extinguishes the humanities, all of this talk. So I think the debate and the crisis will go on for some time yet.
For sure.
So do we have any further contributions? Yes, Penny Welsh, I think, has come in. Do you want to come onto camera, Penny?
Sure thing, yeah. What you said about instrumentalism and elitism made me ask the question that as societies led by governments have expanded access to higher education, is it the case that they really don't want working class students, in particular, students from ethnic minorities, to have the values that the humanities and to some extent the social sciences represent? That if they're doing nursing or engineering, that's okay, but mass higher education does not include the humanities for everyone.
It's an interesting point, and of course we can speculate about as we just talked about, the criticality and the notion of crisis and how you identify certain forms of crisis in a society if you want those people around, because that's not always very helpful if you want to direct a country maybe in a certain direction. Is that where you're going, Penny? Yeah.
And we've got one more contribution, which is, people always come in late despite my best efforts. Anding Shi, can you come onto camera, please? Anding?
I think she said she wasn't
yes, she
able
wants
to because she's
okay,
in the
let's
library.
respond to the chat. Yeah, let's respond to the chat. Sorry, Lynn. So I'm interested in the 4 purposes of doctoral education you mentioned: discipline, employability, citizenship, and justice. Which of these purposes do you think Denmark's current doctoral education is closer to?
It's a good question, and maybe it touches back to what one of your considerations before, also Simon, about maybe the place where Denmark is historically. I think that citizenship dimension maybe is not it's not random. Maybe it's there for a reason, that there is a hope that academics actually will contribute and will participate, not just economically, but actually through collaborations. And there is a real interest also from various institutions and publics. So maybe the publics are reaching out to academics too, which is a nice sign, you could say. But of course, I don't know which is closest to the PhD. I think our point is that they're equally close, but depending on what you talk about, they become visible in different ways. Yes. But maybe the notion of citizenship is interesting to follow.
Yeah, I think so.
But it seems to me that generally citizenship and justice are more aspirational. Whereas employability is often seen, at least in many countries, as the driver. And of course, discipline we've been talking about, but I like the aspirational incorporation of citizenship and justice. And I guess it would mean that we, as supporters of doctoral education, need to sort of address that. What does it mean? And maybe it's a way of creating a discourse about what we contribute to society. Kind of a way of opening the door that someone referred to earlier. I can't remember whom.
I think so too.
Colleagues, I'm going to have to at this point bring us to a close and say thank you very much for adding to our knowledge of humanities and doctoral education in Denmark, and having an interesting discussion about the humanities, as we've been doing on and off for now a couple of months on our webinar program. Our next webinar is in some jeopardy because we've lost the next 2 planned slots. In one case, we've had to rearrange around the UK academic strike, which I won't go into the detail. The strike's now, we think, over, but the rearrangement of our webinar program, unfortunately, has occurred. And in the other case, our presenters had to go back to his own country because of a family matter, and we've rescheduled him to the end of March. So we probably won't have a webinar on Thursday in the usual time slot. We may have one on Tuesday if I can drum up a replacement webinar in time. But if not, our next webinar is the one mentioned in the chat, Work-Life Balance in Academia, Time, Gender and Transitional Episodes, with 2 presenters from Bangladesh and the United States. Very good webinar, and we look forward to seeing you then, if not before, on Tuesday. Look, thanks again, Søren and Lynn. Thanks very much for coming on the webinar program, and we look forward to seeing you again in whichever guise you'd like to bring forward. Any topic that you'd like to bring forward to us, we'd be interested to discuss with you.
Thanks very much.
Bye for now.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.